my parents always told me a lot of stories about the rolling path and Anansi growing up, and a lot of like fairy tale books and all of that, and so I always just wanted to be a writer. And yeah, it's definitely a dream come true, and this book is a lot about storytelling. It takes a lot of the Anansi stories and tries to bring them to life a little bit. It's about a family in Brooklyn with Caribbean roots that uses stories to kind of get through hard times, and then the characters from the stories end up kind of coming into the scene. So I'm just gonna read from the prologue. Basically in the book it's kind of broken up into sections where it's told from the point of view of one of the sisters, or there's also an omniscient narrator that I was kind of inspired from, you know, the narrator you see in folklore and fairy tales. So, prologue, what's my name? By the time you finish reading this, I will be dead, and you, dear reader, will have forgotten all about me. You see, I am what they call your faithful narrator, found in places the West calls fairy tales, what men call gossip, what children call magic. Let me tell you a story. This one we call the first. It is a story that sounds like all the others, and yet it is also the one that has allowed for the existence of all that will come afterward. But we'll get to that. In this story, two women sit inside a bar. The first one says, "Let me tell you a story." The second one says, "So tell me already." Okay, she goes. Once upon a time there was a girl. She starts and looks into her drink. Her tongue starts to hang out like an udon noodle. Well, go on, the friend says, mistaking her hanging tongue for excitement. Only the girl's tongue won't move. Oh wait, sorry. The girl's breath is fixed in midair. Her lips form the letter O. Her friend pricks the tongue with her fork to see what's the matter, and the tongue falls out and skitters like worms on the ground. The bartender scoops up all the pieces he can find, and they wriggle in his hands. He worries about the mess he's made. He asks the friend to fetch a jarring cap from the top shelf of the bar in order to contain the skittering tongue pieces. He looks down and notices no blood, only eraser dust. The bartender thinks this is strange, but he goes to the bar to fetch his needle and thread. He begins to sew the tongue back together for the girl. This is a very difficult job for the man, as the pieces of her tongue keep moving, like the tongue doesn't want to be caught. Mountains of eraser dust are flying from her mouth, getting all over the floor. Her breath stands before them. The bartender does a good job of mending, except that he sews her tongue into a piece of paper and stuffs it into her mouth. The girl and her friend rejoice as the girl begins to speak again. But every time she tries to tell her story, the words come out backward. The ending changes. Let me tell you a story. This one will give you hope. Once upon a time there was a girl, and this girl grew to be a woman. And this woman had the ability to conjure stories from ghosts. Now the conjure woman had 3 daughters who loved her stories so much that when she died, it was all that she left them. Little did they know that these stories had a life before them, that this book had a life before me. You see, the woman and her family existed in a place called Brooklyn, where the maples lined the pavement, and the houses were made from limestone and brownstone, and that glittered like stars do under moonlight. It must have been divine providence that white folks refused to live on these streets, believing they were haunted, therefore leaving the most beautiful houses to be claimed by the descendants of slaves from all across the Atlantic. White folks were not entirely wrong about the haunting either. If you were to walk down these streets, you might hear the faint sound of steel drum and boombox and chickadee and pigeon, or you might hear the chattering of ghosts, the spirits of colonialists, Ashanti warriors, slaveholders, African griots, mythic creatures, and stories long since forgotten. But while white folks may call this a haunting, we know them to be the ancestors. After all, they only want to be able to walk through their homes like they did before their deaths, to sit in the kitchen drinking Milo, bestowing wisdom unto their children who are at risk of forgetting all about them. Now this family lived in the only rose-colored building at the end of Maple Street. The youngest called herself Zora, or she who will one day grow up to be a great writer like her namesake. she could be found conjuring her mother's words into stories. Or if not, she could be caught face flushed with embarrassment, fantasizing about a boy or two. And then there was Sasha, the eldest, who felt her story should shine brightest for once. Commonly referred to as the black sheep, or she who nearly disappeared until she found her true self. This girl did have spunk. They say the girl had a chip on her shoulder, the size of El Tepuche Mountain for nearly everyone, but particularly for her father, who, legend had it, defeated a rolling calf with only a penknife and the power of his gaze. Even with the new baby on the way, the family still fought like wolves, cunning in their ability to wound each other. The man they called father moved out one day to live with a woman who didn't expect bread to be baked by stories. New daughters were birthed, several hearts were broken, and the maple trees were cut down and replaced with coffee shops. At this point, we all should have known what was coming. The scars that would form, the wounds that would never heal. It's true that Anansi stopped visiting the man's dreams at night. He couldn't tell his stories the way he used to. Images of Anansi, the rolling calf, and the purple balloon came and went in spurts. The wife, on the other hand, never stopped believing in magic. But I will never forget the day that I first arrived in the arms of the sisters. It was the day when my two girls got me as their Christmas present. I was sitting quietly between words, inside the blank spaces of the Anansi stories, waiting to be unwrapped. You see, the book I lived in had been given to them by their mother, who got it from her grandmother, who got it from an Ashanti priestess, who was there when it got made. Rumor had it that all women who tried to read the Anansi stories aloud had their throats and tongues cut from their bodies like farm animals. The sisters had no idea the lengths that had been taken to keep these words alive, but every night they would sit in the kitchen over Milo and go, "I am Nanny, leader of the Maroons, mother of all Jamaicans." The eldest, Sasha, wraps her hair in a pillowcase and holds up a shell, imagining it is an abang. She speaks to her fellow countrymen. "Please, if you can, imagine you are invited to watch these girls right now. Pretend you are a part of the enactment. Pretend you can decide how this story will end." Hint, the setting is a kitchen. The scene's objective is to show two sisters conjuring history. Sister 2, also known as Zora. Yes, you are Nanny, lady who caught bullets in her behind and farted them out at her enemies. Sister 1, also known as Sasha. Disgraceful, you are banished from my maroon cell. Sasha, I am Queen Nanny, the only African living in Jamaica who was never taken into bondage. Nanny forced the British troops to allow the Maroons to live in peace. This pot here represents the cauldron that burns without the use of fire. It lured the British into its waters. Sasha points to her mother's pot in the kitchen. The British troops try to climb up Blue Mountain, but they fall right before the peak, breaking their backs in two. In three. One for the dupes they tricked into becoming one with their militia, 2 for the bloodhounds that eventually brought them down, 3 for the bastard that killed Nanny. The one they call Sasha stops stirring. The cauldron turns back into a pot. The air beating beneath it becomes fire. It was yesterday that they picked me up in their textbook and saw it plain. Jamaica's national hero, affectionately referred to as Nanny, is of mythic status. Leading historians do not know how much of her existence has been fabricated by the oral tradition prominent in Jamaican culture. What is known to be true is that she was betrayed and murdered by one of her own, a man they call William Cuffy. This was the first time I ever heard that version, the one where she died. Right then I felt the spirit slip from the ink and get cold. Of course, in my version, she's still alive, replaying over and over again her final battle. Sometimes she shoots down the entire British army, using only one bag of arrows. Sometimes she uses her cauldron to create more arrows. Sometimes the cauldron makes a soup that is poison to her enemies, but antidote to her fellow Maroons. I could never forget that story. There are burn scars from the cauldron that run up and down my thighs. Some days I forget what happened, and then I taste the Bambian escovitch she made for Cujo on my tongue. I feel her handkerchief rub up against my cheek. There are scars that have faded that I feel some mornings. My hands are blistered, my breasts are chapped. But I especially love the way my two girls tell it. That is until this time, the time that she died. And I know we just met, but I have a small request for you. I need you to save my life. Yet already I feel your interest in me waning. You think that despite the fact that I've called you by name, my words do not concern you, that someone else will pick up these words and take on the job themselves, that you don't have what it takes to save a girl like me. And because you choose to be my voyeur and sit here watching me, you too have become a part of this crime. You may have to pay for this someday. But don't worry, you don't need to do much. All you gotta do is know my name. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharma, and thank you everyone for coming. The Niger Wife is about a woman or a group of women, the foreign wives of Nigerian men who live in Nigeria. And it's a fictional story, but inspired by my 7 years as a Niger wife in Lagos. And in a way, it's just a fun story about a woman who disappears and the family search to find her. But I think I'm also looking at questions of identity that came from a very personal perspective. So being Black in an African country that's not my country, what does that mean? And looking at being removed from a Western country, questions about marriage. I'll just read a small section. At the end of that section of the tour, the guide led them to a scuffed blue canoe with a spluttering motor that would take them across the strip of water to the so-called point of no return on the island of Barafu that lay between them and the Atlantic. The prisoners had been loaded onto ships from there and taken across the ocean to the Caribbean, South America, and the United States, where they would be sold off at auction like cattle. Barafu, he explained, meant take them and go. Take them and go. He said the island had once been inhabited, but they'd all been carted off by the Portuguese too. Bilal hesitated to get into the canoe. She heard him muttering prayers as they sat on the rough wooden slats and put on flimsy foam harnesses handed to them by the boatman. They set off. It wasn't far. Unlucky if the boat capsized right in the middle. Claudine tried not to think about the crocodile sign she had seen by the roundabout. The island still had the remnants of a colonial jetty. Mildewed stone walls rose out of the water, recognizable English architecture, stone railings with curved posts. Many were now decrepit, fallen, crumbled. No attempt to repair them. They climbed the roughly hewn steps, arriving on flat scrubland. A trail of flattened earth led them through ankle-length grass with wiry bushes on either side, and in the distance, a forest of skyscraper palm trees. The guide said the walk was about a mile. At least Claudine had worn her running shoes. They soon arrived at a simple brick well with a thatched roof over the top, surrounded by a white-painted stone wall. A sign read, "Original spot, slaves, spirit, attenuation, well." The well of forgetting, the guide said, where the slaves would drink and forget everything before being loaded onto the ships. He kept calling them slaves, she noticed, as if they weren't people, his people, Africans, as if he had no connection. He pointed to an inscription. "Here you will forget your names, your people, your language, and become ghosts." Claudine and Bilal peered down into the well's dark oblivion. It sounded as if herbs had been put in the water. They drugged the prisoners, making them easier to move on to the ships. It also served as ceremonial last rites. From this point on, they were dead. They ceased to exist. Their identities erased. What happened next would no longer matter. And it worked, didn't it? Over the centuries, forbidden to speak their specific languages or practice their traditional spiritual beliefs, they forgot. What was left? fragments from different cultures and peoples had been jumbled together along with the European and indigenous influences. A few words remained, some dishes, physical characteristics, cultural practices, echoes from unknown points of origin, like Papa San's grandmother speaking the original Swahili. He was adamant that's what it was, not that Papa San knew any African language to know for sure. He couldn't remember any of the words his grandmother and mother had tried to teach him. But it was true that people still spoke West African languages in cockpit country, where his grandmother was born. They were Africans too. But Africa was an idea of who they might be, not a specific people they actually were, or a village they could trace their ancestry to with certainty. Claudine followed the guide onward, but looked back and noticed Bilal staring into the well overcome. It took her shouting to get his attention, and when he caught up to them, he wouldn't meet her eyes. The ocean sprang into view, suddenly and without warning, stopping Claudine mid-step. After the dreary shrubs, its glittering surface seemed to light up the sky. Her ears were filled with the roar of the waves, and the ground rumbled beneath her feet. Surely the captors would have fallen to their knees in terror here, screaming, yanking desperately against their weighty shackles, to see a great dark sea monster waiting in the water at the beach's edge to swallow them up and take them beyond the orange horizon to spit them out in another hell. The beach was deserted. Its sands lay in crisp furrows like yellow frosting. Few people must come here. It was marked only by bits of driftwood, shells, and pebbles strewn across. Trees towered over it. She had never seen such tall trees. How long had it taken them to grow so high? She wondered how old they were, how far could they see, and what did they remember? Bilal had walked ahead to where the ocean froth laced the shore, his smart black shoes leaving dark imprints behind him. He seemed to walk directly into the surf, his shirt a fluttering white flag in the wind, becoming a silhouette against the sun. Claudine was grateful to see a bench set back into the shade, because after that walk her knees were going. She sat down watching him and the guide, who kicked driftwood aimlessly along the sand. The sea met the sky like the past meeting the future with the present stuck on the beach, wondering where it fit in. Claudine recalled her co-worker's remarks with a sad smile. The sky was bigger here. Had Nicole sat here too, thinking about her poor mother Jackie? Her father? Did she have a garden in her dreams where her mother would be waiting for her, lying in the sorrel? Claudine wondered if they were now together. She couldn't see where Nicole could be on this earth, or think of who she might be with. The mystery, it seemed, would never be solved.
Wow, wow, wow. I don't know about you, but I got goosebumps listening to these ladies. And as I said, make sure you get a copy of each of their books if you haven't bought it already. We have about roughly 20-25 minutes. We had a late start, so apologies for that. But I really want to jump into the meat of the matter, which is the topic that we're supposed to be discussing, which is Caribbean literature. And so I have a two-part question for these ladies. And first thing, your books explore various themes such as love, forced and voluntary migration, slavery, post-colonialism, family drama, trauma, folklore, religion, identity, race, multi-ethnicity, violence, abuse, politics. And so my question is, what for you makes each of your books a Caribbean story? And I'd love to hear your thoughts and insights about classifying, these works as a Caribbean story. So what makes a Caribbean story? Is it really just a human story? To what extent does your background affect the way in which you write it at all? So what makes it a Caribbean story, and what do you think about the classification of Caribbean story? So we'll start and go this way.
Oh no. I think I'm like already. I guess that, we start with defining what Caribbean is, and I think that's different for different people. I was a Caribbean studies professor, so we spent a lot of time discussing those kinds. Is it geography? Is it history? And in a lot of cases, we have shared history, right? That's usually the definition. That's why we can include places like Suriname and Guyana and places that aren't geographically necessarily where people think of the Caribbean. So there is that shared history, generally speaking, of indigenous genocide, of transatlantic slave trade, of different kinds of indentured so Europeans and Indians and Chinese, and so on, and colonialism, European colonialism, and the impact of that for over 500 years, and then trying to come out of that. But then there's always anomalies to that, right? So you have places like Haiti, which is a huge anomaly, and a lot of people are not aware of that really incredibly important history of Haiti, of people that fought and died for their freedom, as opposed to having it handed to them over tea and crumpets, which a lot of us was our independence, right? It was signed as a paper, is what I'm trying to say. So, so there's that, those of us that come out of that history, geography, has shaped us in very, very, very particular ways. I don't think there's any other place that really compares to the Caribbean in that sense, in that it's very complex. We're a very complex area, we're a very diverse area, and so that's why you can't put it in a nutshell. It's not monolithic at all. I think one of the defining factors is the diversity and the complexity, and this a history that we're still grappling with, that we have not freed ourselves from, that there's, and I know I talk a lot about this in my stories, the trauma that we are still living with, the pain that we're still living with, and that we're often not aware of. We can't name it, we don't know what it is, and yet we keep replicating it. We're passing it on generation to generation, and we haven't found a way necessarily. To me, one of the things I think first and foremost is that you have to recognize that we are wounded, people, and that I also am a big believer in. Sorry, I'm talking a lot. I'll stop just now. But I think I'm a big believer in epigenetics. That trauma is carried genetically, and I really think we as Caribbean people need to address that. So just quickly back to the stories. Back to what I think we're all. This comes up, just from what we've read. This trauma is what comes up in our book.
Thanks, Camille.
Soraya. What is so interesting, so far my mother is the only one in my family who read the book. And she was like, you only have 2 developed characters. She's like, this is not the Trinidad I know, and all this stuff. And yet then I'll talk to other Caribbean people my age who will feel seen in some of the things that are in the book. Like there's a lot of, for instance, like queerness in the book that my mother doesn't necessarily relate to. And I think that, as Camille said, I think it was important to me to try to show the different kinds of Caribbean that exist even within one Caribbean country. Like my mother is, still Black and Indian, which is a different experience, than other people in Trinidad. Like I had friends when I was in Trinidad who were 100% Venezuelan, but had lived there for years, for instance, and I think that's one of the beauties is that there are so many stories, and I'm really excited that there are so many more Caribbean writers being able to tell their stories so that all of them can be considered Caribbean. But for me personally, I think what was important for me was my love for storytelling, and I think a lot of my love for being a writer came from the stories I grew up with. So I think that's probably the biggest element in here is like the magic and the kind of surrealism and like the, all of the ghosts and just all of that. I think was something I really wanted to highlight for myself in like a Caribbean novel.
And so what I'm hearing so far from you guys is that the Caribbean, there's the stories within our story, you know. Jamaica, our motto is out of many one people, so we have all the different ethnicities, all different experiences sort of blended together in a unique way that makes our region special, you know. Vanessa?
Yeah, I agree with what everybody has said here. I think this book really, a lot of it came out of responding to Nigeria as a Caribbean in a way that wasn't intentional, but so many of the questions that were posed to me and that I ended up posing to myself really did come back to what is my culture? You know, I remember in Lagos during an argument with someone, you know, was told, you know, I don't have to respect you, your people have no culture. And I think that was very much a view that came up often, which it was this view that we are a people with no history, with no culture, because that was interrupted by slavery. And, you know, it really made me have to sort of reclaim that. In a way I didn't have to do so much in the UK because Jamaican culture is very present and influential in the UK. I didn't have those sort of questions put to me, but in Nigeria I really felt put on the spot in a lot of ways, as in Nigeria you have many different cultures, but you have cultures where it definitely feels more whole, and there's a lot more detail in it in terms of how the rules for their society and their festivals and the native spiritual beliefs. So it really pushed me to explore and research my own culture and actually to realize there's so much that is very positive about my culture, which I hadn't really acknowledged, because as I said, just taking it for granted, the diversity of, say, Jamaican culture or Caribbean culture. And so definitely that's something which I wanted to explore. But what I liked about it, okay, is we often have our culture judged by the white gaze, right? But how is it when your culture is judged by another black gaze, an African gaze? I think it's also positive to understand yourself, not simply through the white gaze, right? So it was just it's just another way of seeing yourself and reevaluating yourself. So I think that was a really positive process for me, and yeah, I hope it's makes the book a better read.
Yeah, it makes it definitely a richer book, right? And definitely like underscoring what you guys have been saying. So I'm hearing that there's no monolithic approach, and that, you know, we can't just broad brush all of our regions and our cultures. And, you know, I love that each of your books shines a spotlight on that diversity and that complexity. And so the next question I have is about who has the right to write in terms of cultural appropriation. So each of you have written a Caribbean book, but it's also universal as well, right? Because we know that the specific is also universal. Things about love, things about death, grief, all of that. But what I want to know is if someone with no connection to the Caribbean wrote a story set in the Caribbean, you know, with Caribbean characters, but they're not from our culture. Would you think that's okay? Like, shouldn't a writer be able to, like, if I want to write about people in Alaska, shouldn't I be able to live from Alaska? Like, how do you feel about that issue of the Caribbean story and who has the right to tell it? So we can start on that side. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I definitely come from the point of view of write and sort of be damned. Like, if you're burning to tell a story, tell a story. I think the issues definitely come more into play in terms of who's allowed to tell certain stories, and do people have a rich choice of stories to choose from. I think when you have people who we're only ever going back to a certain demographic to hear from them on other people's stories, that's when I think it's it's a real issue, and I think that's why it's more controversial now, because it's like we're trying to move towards people having the opportunity to tell their own stories in a more authentic way.
Yeah, so I mean, I think I don't like to think about it in terms of, you know, policing what people can and can't write, but I think it's important to reflect on why you want to tell those stories and what is your positionality when telling those stories. So if you're not from that identity and it's already underrepresented in literature, then I think it is important to, like, first of all, reflect on your own privilege. Reflect and like do your research in terms of like how are the harmful ways that we've been represented, and are you replicating that? You know, like for instance, there might be a difference between you writing about your experience as a white person when you went to Jamaica and learned about the culture or whatever, versus maybe you're writing about like, I went there and all I saw was violence and guns, and, you know what I mean? Like, I think it's also dependent on what is the story you're actually telling and why are you telling it. And I think also just noting, going back to, I think what you were saying about the white gaze, that there's certain stories that get privileged over others. So even among Caribbean writers, I know this was something that we talked about before, that there's a lot of white Caribbean writers who have gotten a lot more attention at times than Black Caribbean writers. And then there's certain stories that maybe don't get told as much, like, you know, Chinese Jamaican stories, Venezuelan, Trinidadian stories. And so I think that, yeah, I think all of those things are very important to consider. And I think that really if there is any issue, it's just that sometimes I think white writers, when writing about the other, can take on a very like colonizing approach to writing about it. And it can just be replicating more stereotypes.
Yeah, I think what we're talking about here is questions of power and who holds power. We know that certainly for a very long time it was white colonial people who were telling Caribbean stories. They were the only writers, they were the only people that other, you know, anyone listened to. And then our voices began to be heard, and now Caribbean literature is really big. I mean, look at this festival, for example. I think it's just growing, and this is fantastic. You keep hearing things like, oh, books are dying, and it's like, no, they're not. People are reading, they're reading more, and they're looking for more diverse literature, and that's great. So it's giving space to us, but at the same time, I think, you know, there's also the caveat that it's really competitive out there. This is something else we've been talking about. You do notice who gets picked up, who gets the props, who gets the media, who gets the deals, who gets the aid, like all of that, right? It's very clear. And so although there's more space for us, it's not like, wow, okay, we could relax now. We're still struggling, we're still battling, we still have to fight against this huge monolith of white literature, white authors, white publishing companies. And I shouldn't just say white, but white and first world, particularly male. You know, there's still a lot of male privilege in the publishing world. North America, like even those of us that are in the diaspora versus those of us in the region, like it's a huge big deal. And so, something else I was gonna say. You know, we still have to continue to fight for that space. And it's the other thing, this is what I wanted to say. This whole question of whether people can relate or not to your writing, to your characters, to your story. Like you see this repeatedly, and like I'm not a fan of Goodreads, so I'll just say, like, but that was one of the things that really threw me. It was when my book came out and the Goodreads, you know, reviewers come out, and so many people kept saying, I couldn't relate to the characters. I couldn't relate to the story. And I'm like, is that what you read? Like, do you only read, like, you know, a reflection of yourself and your reality? Like, why are you not interested to expand, you know? So But that somehow still holds weight. Like when you look at, why are certain authors and books winning awards and getting the deals and being adapted into screenplays and these kinds of things? Is it because it is relatable? And then you also notice that in a lot of cases with those writers and those publishing houses, they don't say a Caribbean book or a Caribbean character or a Nigerian, whatever. It's just like a man and a woman, right? And they don't have to explain who these people are. You look at the review and you're like, well, I can't relate to that. Right? But so many of us are still reading the mainstream.
No, I agree, but I think there's also a lot of hope because if we have time, we come to monetizing your work, and you know that Vanessa's book is going to be made into an HBO series. It's a big deal. I know that Soraya has a lot of buzz and interest about network deals too. Like I can see all of these things being books, right? Like I feel like the future is a positive one for the Caribbean story. So we know that there are challenges, definitely, but I think that there is an appetite, there's a market. There are readers out there who, want to read these kind of stories that have nothing to do with their culture and identity, and they want to, so I think that is something that we need to acknowledge as well too. And Soraya said something interesting about other, and I want to kind of touch on this kind of controversial question. Is there a sense in which you may feel like you're other from the Caribbean identity, and how does that inform your work? I really would love to hear you guys. So you start. Come on.
Okay. I mean, in a lot of ways I feel other, because I am, the child of immigrants. I grew up in New York, so it's a very different experience. And I grew up with a lot of, Black American culture and grew up being the minority. So it's very different in a lot of ways from my parents. And then I also kind of have the two, like, rival islands, Jamaica and Trinidad.
Yep.
So, yeah, I think that it's like a very different experience in a lot of ways. And then, like, as I mentioned before, I think one thing that also felt that I sometimes, was struggling with was like having queer characters exploring their gender identity, talking about people going to like gay parties in Trinidad, and so actually some of my other extended family, because I said my immediate family only my mother read it, but extended family, other people had read it, and I was very worried about their reactions, particularly about the stuff about sexuality, and they were like, well, I don't read things just to agree with them, which I think goes to what you were saying, Camille, that you don't have, why do you need to relate to them? You don't have to read something that's your life. So, yeah, I mean, I think that has been really positive for me, and I think that even though it's a different experience, it's also an important one, because in Brooklyn, of course, there are so many Caribbean American people that similarly feel a little bit of like both worlds, and not really in one completely. And so I think that it goes back to just every story is important to tell.
Love that. Vanessa?
Yeah, I mean, my 84-year-old grandmother had come from Jamaica to stay with me the past 2 weeks. And she went to the UK during the Windrush years, like in the late 60s. And all my grandparents are Jamaican. And one thing she said, which really hit me, was she said that she feels othered in Jamaica where she lives now. And she's been living there for over 20 years. And she said they call her the mad English woman. and that really struck me that, wow, even she, where, she's somebody who, if you don't understand patois, you're probably gonna struggle to even follow her conversation, because she is speaks in very strong patois. So even she's saying she's othered in her community in Jamaica. So I think it just sort of puts it into perspective to people, there not being one story of being Jamaican and one story of being Caribbean. Everybody's sort of trying to fit in wherever they are. As I said before, like there's more Jamaican people living outside of Jamaica than inside Jamaica, and I think that's part of the Jamaican story, because after slavery, Jamaicans had to leave the island continuously in order to seek their fortune. So that is almost a facet of being Jamaican, is the fact that you have to leave and hopefully come back at some point, you know?
Yeah, I love that. And you end up in all parts of the world. You know, I studied in New Zealand for a while, and I saw Jamaicans. They're like, "What are you doing here? Like, this is so far." You know, but yeah, we're everywhere, and it's like part of that Caribbean experience. You know, making a better life overseas, and then returning in your post-retirement years to spend the rest of your life there and stuff. It's very interesting. Camille?
Yeah, you're asking if we feel othered by Caribbean.
Well, no, just generally in terms of your culture and where you sit. Do you feel othered in terms of your writing, and if so, does that affect your writing in any way?
In comparison to the larger literary community, oh my gosh, of course, and for the reasons that I said, you know, it's sometimes people don't know what to do with you, and when I say people, I mean people in the industry, right? Like publishers and editors and agents and so on. They're not quite sure. We had a bit of a discussion around that as well. They're not quite sure what to do with you. Then they want you to do a lot of the legwork too. Things like, well, who's your market? You know, how big is that market? Like, because it all comes down to dollars and cents. So again, this is why festivals like this are helpful. And you can say, well, you know, there was this festival and X amount of people attended it, and they bought books, and because they don't know, they're not paying attention to what's happening out there, right? So, but yeah, and then you can get lost into these other worlds. Like apparently I'm listed under world literature in certain places, which is like world music, but no, it's not. You know, or black, or you know, something else. And I straddle Canadian Caribbean too, because I'm dual citizen, and you know, so I'm wearing this hat. Like sometimes it's Cam lit, and other times it's Caribbean lit, you know, or BIPOC or whatever.
What is BIPOC?
Black Indigenous People of Color.
Oh,
Acronym.
okay, learn something new. Okay, well, that's very interesting, and I mean, I want to talk a little, kind of picking up on that, about language, the role of nation language in your books. Are you conscious of the kind of language choices you make as a Caribbean writer? You think about, in terms of bringing it back to money, audiobooks and, you know, the voices of the characters, you know, because if you make it too authentic, people may not be able to understand if you're not from there. You know, talk to me a little bit about that role of language. Yes,
I want to talk about this. One of the stories in here is written entirely in Trinidad Creole. And I didn't give a damn. I didn't think twice about it. I was doing it, and and then people were like, "You were so brave," and I'm like, "Why?" I mean, Salvin was writing, and we've been writing in our language, for some time. I mean, it's not new. It shouldn't still be such a shocking thing. And thankfully, I'm very happy to say that the response to it, outside of Goodreads, the response to it has been really positive. All my editors were white Canadians, and the publishers and so on. Not entirely the publishers, but nobody said anything. Nobody went, "You can't possibly." No one's gonna. You need to put a glossary, right? And I attended a big literary festival in Toronto back in the summertime, Word on the Street, and I went to panel after panel where you had all these racialized writers, writers whose roots were in the global south, and they were all saying, I'm not changing my language. You're gonna have to figure it out. I'm not putting a glossary. You're gonna have to figure it out. And I know Kevin Hussain, who's here, right, the author of Hungry Ghosts. He said, have Google, right? Like if there's a word you come across, just look it up. Like again, one of my fellow writers in my publishing house as well. She's African American background. She's mixed background, but one of her parents was African American. And she said, yeah, when I started it, I don't know any Creole, but I just took my time and I figured it out. It wasn't rocket science. So, I think too, and I've also heard some Caribbean authors censor themselves. They're very, to me, it seems a lot of authors who live in the region are more hesitant to do this than those of us maybe who are diaspora. But they're a little afraid, wary of doing that, and then, you know, they'll talk to me or someone else, just do it. Like, come on, that's how we speak, right? That's how we think.
I love it, and that lyricism of, especially Trini, I think Trini sing when they talk. I love the Trini accent. And that comes out in your book, you know. And it's the same experience I had with my book. Like Patois, you know, my white UK publisher, she's not Jamaican. She could read it and understand. She's like, yeah, and what words I didn't understand, I inferred from the context. You know, we to give our readers more credit, I think.
Right, like we read Shakespeare.
We're forced to reach it.
Yes, I mean, I do feel like we've come a long way in being able to include different dialects, different languages, in major publishing houses, in the States, and I think maybe in Canada too, in the UK, hopefully, I don't know. But the audiobook. I have some words about my audiobook, because I think a lot of the times you don't really have much say in who is doing the narration. I had no say, and I didn't get to hear it until it was already out for the public. And I remember the one thing that I did tell them was that there is a lot of dialogue. That was important to me. And the person, you know, does very well for certain things, the parts that are just told by like the American sisters. But anytime it's the parents, and it's supposed to be dialect, like it doesn't even sound like a watered down Caribbean accent. It just doesn't sound Caribbean, like at all. It doesn't even, like I don't know what I'm listening to. It sounds kind of like when they try to have like that one made up accent that's not from a particular country, but it's just vaguely somewhere out there. And yeah, it is. I think that we see that too in like film and television still. Like I think that that's like a whole other barrier to get through. That because there of course are Caribbean actors and voice actors that can do it.
Yes.
You know, and honestly, even if it wasn't a trained voice actor, they still would have been better. So,
You could have done it yourself, I think.
my mother said she wanted to do it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm hopeful that we just keep pushing. I have heard other audiobooks where it has like they've gotten like Patsy by Nicole Dennis Ben had a Jamaican person do their audiobook, and I thought that was great. And so they're definitely out there. Maybe there's ways we could all push for it to be
Yeah, I think we have to.
required. Yeah.
Agreed.
They don't want too much.
Yeah. Anything to add, Vanessa?
I totally agree with what has been said. Camille, the first rule of good reads is don't read the reviews. Yeah, I don't feel like I've had that much struggle myself. I think perhaps I have been lucky in that I don't feel like, because even my YA book, Rude Girls, had a lot of patois in it, that I've really had a lot of pushback on the patois. I've had a lot of pushback in other ways, in terms of like explaining aspects of Caribbean culture. Perhaps you don't particularly want to have to explain, or explaining characters. We have our own ways, and having those ways to have to be really put in a sort of a Western context, I found that way. So my issue was not so much on the patois being understood, but I think some of my favorite authors have really given me a lot of, I feel like they paved the way for me to just write my patois sort of unafraid. I mean, one of those is actually Zora Neale Hurston, because she was critiqued a lot for writing in a very southern dialect, and her being such an amazing writer, and seeing how much she's loved today has, really given me the confidence to just write it and trust that it's going to be, you know, met with appreciation. And so far, it seems to be. But I'm also coming from a more colonized context, so being in the UK, so my patois may already be diluted, you know.
But it's true to the place and the people. So, and I would say, you know, your book is finding the success. There's a good one in America. We kind of know even more ahead. So I think that's a good, again, strong signal that there's an interest, there's a market. We just have to write quality. You know, there's no excuse for not writing quality, but write quality, the readers will come, I think. We have to wrap up soon, but I want to give the audience an opportunity in case you have a burning question. I have one more. Well, actually, you guys don't know this, but we each had like a Google Meet. We had a Google Meet call before, and we were like talking for probably like a good 2 hours about all of these things. So if you set us loose, we probably will be here till midnight. So, did the audience have any questions? though? Did anybody have anything they want to ask before I ask my final? Yes.
When I sit down your path has been to finding editors and publishers. And I came out from California to attend this, so thank you.
I did the usual sending out my manuscript and it ending up in slush piles. And then I was fortunate enough to have a former student of mine who was doing the slush pile, because I wasn't sure if that publisher wasn't even on my radar, and she goes, no, send it in, they're starting a new imprint. So it was, I think I had like 26 rejections or something like that, like really, like it helps to hear that. And again, Kevin Hossain was very helpful because he published a piece, if you guys have ever read it, Kevin Hossain, about all the rejections he went through before he really started to find success. And he even self-published one of his novels and so on. So you might be lucky, but you just have to hang in there.
Yes, I remember going to a reading and somebody was like, the author was talking about how it was like her 5th book or something, but it was her first one to be published. You know, and I was just thinking about, wow, like to have that, like I don't know if I could have made it. Like I think it just takes so much believing in yourself to just, you know, believe it will happen one day. I think in some ways I got lucky. There was somebody in the MFA program I went to who ended up becoming an agent later, and had read my manuscript and had then decided to become my agent. We definitely went through a lot of revisions, and you know, I think I mentioned before it took like 10 years. A lot of it was like rewriting and all of this before we ended up sending it to editors. And we were able to find someone who, though not Caribbean, she was also an immigrant from India and was also a writer. So I think kind of understood a lot about, you know, writing from perspectives that are not the white American perspective, and not wanting to have to explain everything and all of that. So I think that we were able to work really well together. It's definitely important to have a editor that understands you and like what you're trying to do, and isn't trying to like rewrite your book. Yeah.
So for me, I really think a lot of it is about connections that you make in the industry, which take you up the slush pile, because to get out of that slush pile is really tough. You need a lot of luck. But if you have a connection, so for example, if you had done a residency, like I did a residency at Tin House, which was very instrumental in terms of getting my manuscript together, with the editor even giving me a reference. Then when I queried agents, I have it in my query letter that Tin House have recommended me, you know, said this manuscript is good to go, and they're actually interested in it. You know, when I was published at 16, that particular, that was YA, the headmistress of my school helped me to get an agent. So that was complete luck, but again, it was like a connection that kind of took me to the top of the slush pile. If you do workshops, you find out information from other writers, and if you're lucky, you can get knowledge of agents through other writers, or agent events where you can go there. And I went to the Bronx Festival, and I did an agent speed dating there, which was just on the spot. And I sat with like 3 agents, and they were 3 agents that then I queried with my full manuscript. So all of these little connections can help you to, once you have spoken to an agent, they know you, and they'll at least reply to you. A lot of agents just never reply. And they say it's like a 1 in 6,000 chance of getting an agent. I just pulled completely from Google, I haven't tested it. But I mean, that gives you an understanding of like how tough it is. You can have the best book, you can have a great query letter, but sometimes you just need a little contact to take you over the edge. I even asked on my Nextdoor app if there was an agent who would read my manuscript, and an agent actually made me an offer from that. So you have to get creative, really mine your contacts. Don't be afraid to ask writers about their agents, and then really research agents, and really get someone to look at your query letter before you send it out. These are all little ways to just help break through the fog of querying, and it takes a long time. Like for some people it can take a year, 2 years to get an agent. Some people it's overnight, it's luck.
Oh, if I could add one thing that you made me think of is, because, I think in both of our cases, like I met my agent through an MFA program, and you're saying like you got help through the residencies you were doing, but sometimes you don't get into those. I think it's important to have a writing community, which I feel like I've been growing more and more. Granted, I think I kind of started doing that as I got my book deal, but in some ways I wish I had it before that, because it's been very helpful to, and I've been surprised at how open other writers are that are more established, and just talking about their processes, talking about what they did, and I feel like it's been very helpful. Like I'll go to just like readings, for instance, if I find out that someone's having a book launch or like some kind of writing event, like I'll go and meet people, and I ended up like starting a Writers of Color meetup group in New York, and it started small and it kind of grew word of mouth, and it's very, very helpful, because you really do realize that so much is about who you know. Yeah, like I'll find out that like I got onto a panel somewhere, and it's because somebody recommended me and I didn't even know, and like it's just, yeah, it's definitely helpful. And even besides what you can get from it, I think it's just, you can have other people who've gone through the same struggle and experience, so even if it's not getting you a connection per se, it's still helpful, I think.
Yeah, just to add, because I know we're wrapping up now, I know we're well over time, but I want to underscore what everyone said, but also you have to hone your craft, right? So, because if you do get an agent interested, you don't want to say, oh, I'm only in chapter 5, they may be interested in what you said. You have to have something that you feel is good, you can stand behind. So even if you have to invest in like an editor, share it with other writers, like get it in as best a shape as you can, knowing that my agent, I don't have a US publisher, I have a UK publisher, so if any of you know any US publishers, send them my way. Also, don't be afraid to ask what you want, what you want, put it out there. So when Sherry Jones, who wrote How the One-Armed Sister Sleeps Her Host, I think it was 10 years she took to write that too. And she said, initially she was querying agents and then said, yeah, I'm interested, but she didn't have the rest of it, so she couldn't send them anything. And then she just lost her nerve. So have a good book and have it ready. And ask her what you want, put it out there, let you, like now you know us, reach out to us on social media, keep in touch, and find out like the writers that you like, whose work aligns with yours. We all thank our agents in the acknowledgement. So just read the acknowledgement and you see who our agents are. You write them and say, oh, my work is similar to Sharma, Taylor's, Camille, Soraya, Vanessa. I met them at BCLF. hey, you know, like, don't be afraid to do that. I did that. I queried agents. I told them, you know, exactly what my work is like with people they already represent. And yeah, and that's how I got my agent. You know, it's a lot of luck, yes, but I think you have to put yourself out there. You have to just put yourself out there and just keep trying and never give up. You know?
Somebody has a hand in a question.
Oh,
Hi, I have a question. I understand that we over time.
we're well over, but we're still here. I mean, to make it come soon.
This pertains to the other unrelatability question you asked previously. W.E. Du Bois coined this term called double consciousness in relation to how Black Americans like view themselves and how people view them. Would you say that could also apply to you, but in a shifted context? Even at one point, triple consciousness, oh my God, I'm sorry, because of being from the UK and also being Jamaican and living in Lagos. Like, would you say through your writing, you had to think about that?
It's a deep question, deep philosophical one. You
Only
all
if you
answer
want
that.
people in here.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, I'll speak to that. Just in what Du Bois was saying was that we have to understand the white world, right? We have to understand the mainstream. We have to understand the power paradigm, and then we understand ourselves. Oops, sorry, that was me. Then we understand ourselves. So we live with that duality, right? Whether it's I guess in a sense, you know, for someone like myself, or I guess all of us here who are diasporic, Caribbean, and then living in white supremacist societies. Yeah, you have to. It's tough. You know, I really like what Vanessa was saying there about the way in which we think of it as a duality. Like maybe I'm here now in the United States, right? And it's that has been the construct here, black and white. But that's not the reality around the world, right? So when you take a perspective like what Vanessa is saying, what does it mean to be a British-born, Jamaican heritage person living in a country like Nigeria, right? Where there's notions of purity, where there's notions of tradition, where there's notions of culture that goes back thousands of years, and then that's being foisted on you, right? So we're always again grappling with issues of power, right? Who holds the power? And who holds the power to name other people and determine other people, you know, tell you, I mean, this is in this book here, read the book, right? But it's, my personal experience has been one of always being told who I am, my whole life. Always being told if I belong or I don't belong. And I'm not just talking about the white Canadian society I grew up in. I'm also talking about Caribbean people, right? Who are very quick to tell me. I've had people tell me, you don't look Trinidadian. What the hell does that mean? Have you been to Trinidad? Like, you know, or things like that. Or I'm not this, I'm not that. You are this, you are that. It's crazy. So we do this kind of categorizing and pigeonholing of each other. And it all goes back to colonialism, all of it. It all goes back to this idea of having power over and determining and feeling like you somehow are worthy of naming other people and putting them in their place. And it's bullshit.
Yeah, and on those words, it's an appropriate place for us to close out. You see when I tell you that we could do this for hours, and you can come and talk to us at the end, because we go on. You know, she's an academic, so she's going to ask some tough, deep questions. Soraya being an activist, going to go into all the power thing, Vanessa being a journalist, going to take all the journalistic questions and take it from all angles, like literally. And I'm a lawyer, I can't talk. So we'll take this all day, all night. You have to literally grab the mic away from us, you know? But I just want to close by thanking each one of these lovely ladies for taking the time, being here, you know, just so honored to be in conversation with you guys. I want to thank you guys for staying well over the time. It's like 4 o'clock now. Really, really appreciate you. But I can't go yet. I want to know for each of the ladies, what's next for you? Just in 30 seconds. What's your next thing? Because now you have lifelong fans who want to follow your work. What's the next thing for you? 30 seconds.
It was mentioned in my bio, but I'm writing a historical novel right now. Partly Caribbean, but also not. It's a global story.
I'm working on a memoir, and I have these little cards that one of the young people I used to work with, she drew these. So you see this is Old High and Anansi, the rolling path, Mama Glow. So you guys could take one, and then, you know, so even if you can't get the book, you have a little piece of it. And it also has a QR code to buy the later.
Great marketing, guys. You need to have some good marketing things like her. Yeah, I love it. Vanessa?
Yeah, just working on the next one and getting ready for the UK release, which will be early next year now. So back and forth.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you, ladies. Let's give
I would just like to say thank you for opening BCLF 5 with us. Thank you, Camille, Soraya, Sharma, and Vanessa for doing this opening segment. You guys raised a lot of important
We didn't
topics.
even go through half the questions.
I know, it happens every time. It happens every time, but the conversation continues weekend long. We have 10 more events to go. So I hope you guys are going to join us this afternoon at 6:30 at the Center for Fiction. It's on 15 Lafayette. Please come through. We're overbooked, but we make room. Books are on sale at the back. Please support the writers. They are telling our stories, and we need to keep the stories alive. So please, we always say BCLF works to support writers, and a lot of what I heard here today really resonates because the work we're doing internally is really about supporting Caribbean writers across the board. So you guys talking about US publishers, we're working on it. You're talking about being able to market and PR, we're working on those things too. So we are very serious. It's 5 long years, it's just 3 of us doing all of the work, but we are working. Please don't, so yeah, so please join us at the next event, and I'd love to see your lovely faces. Thank you so much for coming.
Get them autographed.
Okay, well, I just signed mine.
I it's just,
I'll give her one here.
and it's actually about Trinidad. And the artists and creators
Okay.
and culture people from Trinidad.